Now our exclusive report. Senior Liberal Democrats have been accused of failing to act decisively on a series of complaints about sexually inappropriate behaviour that took place in the highest echelons of the party. Despite a public commitment to stamping out sexual harassment, Channel 4 News can reveal that a number of women accuse its former chief executive, Lord Rennard, of abusing his position by inappropriately touching and propositioning them. And while we've been on air, the Lib Dems have told us that as a result of our investigation, Nick Clegg has announced an immediate review of the party's procedures for dealing with allegations of harassment. Here's Cathy Newman.
At the last election, Nick Clegg published a manifesto vowing that the Liberal Democrats would build a society where everyone has the opportunity to get on in life. At the heart of that commitment to equality was a promise to tackle sex discrimination in the workplace. And last year, the Lib Dem leader and the Prime Minister signed an EU deal to stamp out all forms of sexual harassment. Yet this programme understands that for years, the party which now helps govern the country seemingly failed to do enough to root out sexual impropriety by its most senior employee. The invisible hand behind the Liberal Democrats' electoral success over the last 30 years is this man, Chris, later Lord Rennard. You might not have heard of him, but his political campaigning skills have seen him called a legend, a guru, even a genius. And that meant he could pull the strings and control the purse strings of a succession of leaders: Paddy Ashdown, Charles Kennedy, Ming Campbell and Nick Clegg.
But Channel 4 News has uncovered another side to Lord Rennard, at odds with his stellar reputation within the party. We've heard complaints from a number of women in the Liberal Democrats who say that the man who in the eyes of some became more powerful than the leader abused that position. They say he propositioned them or touched them inappropriately, and that some senior party figures knew but failed to take swift or decisive action.
I was a professional colleague in a conference, and he put his hand on my knee and suggested that we go upstairs, to his room.
The story here is about a man who abused his position, and his approaches to women were repugnant.
If a political party can't face up to these problems within their own internal affairs, how can they be expected to govern the country?
Until a few months ago, Bridget Harris was a special advisor to Nick Clegg, the Deputy Prime Minister. A decade ago, she'd just been given her first big break in politics, a senior role in the Welsh Parliament. At a conference in 2003 in Swansea, she relished the chance over a late-night coffee to converse properly for the first time with the party bigwig, Lord Rennard.
I had been talking to Lord Rennard in a conference bar. This was my first big job. I was newly married. I wasn't drinking that night. I was on my best behaviour. I was in a very professional mode. As we were carried on talking, he was touching my legs and touching my knees, and he did it 2 or 3 times. And the first time I thought it was an accident, and I sort of crossed my legs. Then the second time I realised he was actually doing it, and then when he tried a sort of a third time, I basically had to physically move away from him. And at that point, I mentally sort of started my countdown about how I was going to stop talking to him and get away from him. And then he asked whether he sort of clearly not noticing the signals of me moving away from him, he then suggested that we take our coffees upstairs to his room. It made me feel embarrassed and upset and disappointed, and the next day I reported it to my line managers because I knew it was wrong and I knew that he shouldn't have done it.
Despite that complaint, this wasn't the end of Lord Rennard's inappropriate behaviour. This woman is still active in the Liberal Democrats and didn't want to be identified. When she was 21 and a candidate, she attended a party event. She'd been chatting with Lord Rennard when a friend suggested taking a photo.
We all kind of hugged up close, as you do in a photo. Chris was stood next to me. He shoved his hand down the back of my dress. I felt really humiliated and very undermined and very shameful.
There is a late-night drinking culture across the political parties, but the woman said his advances had come out of nowhere. Despite that, because of his status, she was reluctant to report it.
Chris was all-powerful in the party, probably more powerful than the party leader. Chris decided who got money and who got support. And when you're a candidate, money is votes.
These two incidents don't appear to be isolated events. We've spoken to other women who've described strikingly similar experiences, which they say were an abuse of Lord Rennard's power. What they've told us seems to suggest a pattern of behaviour. They say the approaches happened out of the blue, in the evening during training weekends for parliamentary candidates.
Alison Smith, a politics lecturer at Oxford University, recounted a slightly different experience. 6 years ago, she was an aspiring Lib Dem activist, and she and a friend were invited back to Lord Rennard's house after having dinner with him in central London.
At first, everything seemed fine. He was on one sofa, we were on the other sofa, and then he just very suddenly got up and plonked himself between us and started moving his hands down their backs to places where they had absolutely no business being.
Both of you at the same time?
Yeah, both of us at the same time. I straight away stood up and said, "No, that's not acceptable, I'm going home." He said, "Oh, you can't go home, you should stay here." And I said, "What do you mean you can't go home?" He said, "There's no taxis." I said, "Well, if there's no taxis, then I'll walk." He said, "You can't walk, you don't know where you are." I said, "Well, of course I know where I am. I'm leaving right now." Got very, very, very cross at that point. He looked surprised, he looked shocked, and he opened the door and we got a taxi home.
Ms Smith says she never felt directly threatened by Lord Rennard, but believes she had to report the incident. It wasn't obvious, though, who to turn to.
You have to remember, Chris Rennard was the chief executive and also the director of campaigns. So basically, the guy who's the problem is at the top of the tree every which way you turn.
So what did you decide to do?
Within a week, I went to Paul Burstow, who was the chief whip at the time. He listened very patiently and sounded very concerned, and then basically said he would do something about it and would be in touch, and then he never was.
What, the chief whip never got back to you? You never heard anything back from him?
No.
Next, Ms Smith approached Jo Swinson, who was then the party's spokesperson for women and equality and is now Minister for Women. She's campaigned vigorously on equal rights, putting down a motion in Parliament on unwanted sexual touching and harassment. Ms Smith says Ms Swinson agreed to investigate and spoke to other women who'd alleged Lord Rennard had behaved inappropriately.
She certainly uncovered for sure that this was a very serious pattern of behaviour.
She told you that?
Yeah. She said that the problem with taking it forward was that nobody wanted to make a formal complaint. It very quickly became quite Kafkaesque. I was saying, they were saying nobody wants to make a formal complaint, and I was saying, well, I'll make a formal complaint, and they're saying, well, that's a shame because nobody wants to make a formal complaint.
And you had made a formal complaint, really? Well, in going to Paul Burstow?
Yeah, exactly. That was my point. Was what exactly did I need to do to make this a formal complaint? But nobody could tell me that.
We've seen an email sent in October 2008 by a former Lib Dem campaigns officer to a number of women in the party.
There has been a long-standing problem with a number of women where the abuse of Chris's position was clearly inappropriate. I've discussed this today with Jo Swinson, who was aware of a number of cases which largely didn't overlap with the ones I was aware of. Jo tells me that a recent conversation has been had by somebody senior in the party with Chris, and he has been informed that the behaviour has to stop.
The email indicated that the leader's office was now involved. The following year, 2009, 6 years after the first incident we're aware of, Lord Rennard stepped down, citing ill health. He has diabetes. He received a standing ovation at the party conference that year. But Channel 4 News understands there may have been additional reasons for his departure.
I was very much on the understanding, and I was told this specifically by Ros Scott, who was the party president at the time, that he'd stood down. The party had basically forced him to stand down because of these allegations.
We spoke to Baroness Scott. She wouldn't comment on why Lord Rennard had resigned, but told us she was aware of issues about his behaviour. She said if a formal complaint had been made, she would have acted on it, but she said she received no such complaint. Baroness Scott also told us that as a result of the allegations, she instigated a review of the party's whistleblowing procedures. At the party conference in 2009, Nick Clegg's tribute to Lord Rennard could not have been more effusive.
Chris, I can honestly say, if it wasn't for your guidance and encouragement, I wouldn't have been elected as an MP, let alone now be leading the party. And if it wasn't for the Rennard School of Campaigning, this would not be a party ready to transform British politics. And we are immensely, immensely grateful for it. Thank you.
Anyone witnessing this eulogy would be oblivious to the fact that the party had heard repeated allegations about their chief executive's behaviour over a number of years. The Liberal Democrats told Channel 4 News,
"We take allegations of harassment extremely seriously. There are clear procedures for dealing with harassment and bullying."
How would you describe what the party did or failed to do?
Cowardly. I think there, was a lot of denial. A denial about how serious the issue of what Lord Rennard was actually doing. A denial about the effect that was having.
Some of the women we've spoken to say that the party's still in denial. We've established that despite resigning as chief executive, Lord Rennard does appear to be taking an active role. In October, he tweeted that Nick Clegg had nominated him as vice president of an international federation for Liberal parties. The following month, he was voted onto the party's Federal Policy Committee, which draws up their election manifesto. But it's his contact with female candidates which is causing the women we've spoken to some concern. Just last month, he attended a training weekend in Bedfordshire for prospective MPs.
He's also taken part in this speed chat event organised by the Liberal Democrat Campaign for Gender Balance, supporting future women candidates.
To this day, I have no idea how many people in the party were aware of the allegations that women like myself had made about Lord Rennard. And as a result, it's not surprising to me that he has ended up in situations where he's been invited along to things by people who basically didn't know.
Tonight, the Liberal Democrats urged anybody who had issues to raise to use the party's confidential whistleblower procedures. They've promised to respond to any allegations.
Cathy Newman reporting now. In response to our report, solicitors for Lord Rennard told Channel 4 News he has always strived to conduct himself responsibly and appropriately at all times and has no recollection of any inappropriate behaviour. In addition, our client is unaware of any complaint about his conduct ever being made against him. In the case of Alison Smith, he denies behaving improperly. He confirms he has worked with Bridget Harris since 2003 and is unaware of her having grounds for complaint. He added he could not comment on anonymous cases. In addition, Lord Rennard describes as completely untrue any suggestion that he resigned as chief executive as a result of allegations about inappropriate behaviour. While we've been on air, we've had this response from the Liberal Democrats themselves. In view of the serious allegations put to us by Channel 4 and the concerns raised about how such issues have been handled in the past, Nick Clegg has asked Tim Farron, the party president, to establish an immediate review into all our procedures for dealing with these issues, including a thorough examination of how allegations made in the past have been handled, an internal investigation into the specific allegations raised by Channel 4 has begun under the party's disciplinary procedures. We will not tolerate harassment in our party, and we urge anyone to contact the chief executive or use our confidential whistleblower procedure if they have issues they wish to raise as a result of Channel 4's report.